It's lovely to be here today, and I'm very grateful to Parliamentary Outreach for inviting me to talk here, and to the University of Exeter for having me here. I'm here today to talk to you about Parliament and suffragettes. Suffragettes being the militant campaigners for the vote in Parliament. But I'm actually going to start a little bit earlier than that, because I don't think you can just plunge straight into the militancy without understanding what happened before then. So I'm going to rewind you back in time, all the way back to 1832 to start with. Okay, so in 1832, what we have is the first petition presented to Parliament asking for votes for women. Now, of course, the philosophers and some people had been campaigning, discussing, writing about the rights of women before that. Since the late 18th century, Mary Wollstonecraft is the best known person. And women did play a role in campaigning for parliamentary reform in the early 19th century. You can see the picture up here, and you can see, you might be able to see, oh, hang on, got my pointer, there is in fact a woman up there on the platform with other parliamentary campaigners. But in 1832, what happened was the passage of the Great Reform Act, which was the first step in reforming the parliamentary franchise and doing various other things as well. But it gave the vote to a small number of men, a small number, but significantly greater than before. And as a result, it spurred one woman to send a petition to Parliament asking if women too could have the vote. And what you may or may not be able to read is the text of what she said here. Her petition was presented by a Mr. Hunt, and this is Henry Hunt MP, who was known as Orator Hunt, and a very well-known radical MP. And he presented this petition, which was for Mary Smith of Stanmore in the county of York. The petitioner stated that she paid taxes and therefore did not see why she should not have a share in the election of a representative. She also stated that women were liable to all the punishments of the law, not excepting death, and ought to have a voice in the making of them. But so far from this, even upon their trials, both judges and jurors were all of the opposite sex. Now, this argument might sound pretty sympathetic or obvious to us today, but this was not how it was received at the time. Henry Hunt, indeed, introducing his petition, said that it might be a subject of mirth, and indeed that is exactly what happened. There was one MP who responded to this speech in the House of Commons, Sir Frederick Trench, and what he said was, it would be rather awkward if a jury of half males and half females got locked up together for a night, as often happened with juries. This might lead to some rather queer predicaments. So there you go. And to which Mr. Hunt riposted that he well knew that the honourable and gallant member was frequently in the company of ladies for whole nights, and he did not know that any mischief had resulted from those circumstances. So basically, this petition was laughed out of the House of Commons. And then not a great deal happens for a number of years. And then petitioning starts up again in the 1860s, when organised bodies of women started to get together for the first time to campaign for the vote. Now, the big famous petition to Parliament was in 1866. It was presented by John Stuart Mill, and it had 1,500 signatures on it. Today, perhaps that doesn't sound very much to you all, because we live in the days of sort of internet petitioning, where campaigns on the internet can maybe rustle up thousands or millions of signatures on something. But if you can picture what life would have been like for a group of middle-class, upper-class women in the mid-19th century trying to collect signatures on a petition, asking their friends, their family members, maybe their servants, to sign a petition. 1,500 signatures was actually a very large number in those circumstances, I think, before, sort of, as I say, much organisation had gone into such a subject. The 1866 petition to Parliament doesn't survive, unfortunately, because very few original petitions do survive to Parliament in this period. But you can see an example of one here from a little bit later. This is a women's suffrage petition for the mistresses of Dulwich High School, and it survives because it went to the Lords rather than the Commons. Some of the Lords petitions do survive, including this one, and it's rather nice, the sort of the loopy handwriting. And then at the bottom here, you can see the names and addresses of all the individual schoolmistresses who signed this petition. And of course, these would have been educated women in teaching, which is one of the very few professions open to middle-class women in this period. They would have possibly owned property, they would have certainly rented property. If not, they would have definitely paid taxes, and they thought they should be able to vote. But this did not happen. So the vote was extended to more men, to working-class men, first in 1867 and then in 1884, and by this point about 60% of men could vote. but not one woman. Women were actually barred from the franchise by the Great Reform Act of 1832, which defined a voter as a male person. So there you go. I should say that this didn't mean that women had no influence in politics. Women certainly played a role, particularly in local politics, where women could not only vote but stand at local level for as poor law guardians, for school boards, and in some local government bodies. Full equality in local government came in 1907 with the right to stand for county and borough councils. And also some women engaged in politics through family or social networks as political hostesses, the wives, sisters, aunts, mothers of politicians in Parliament, some of whom exercised a great deal of power on the events of the day. But they couldn't vote. In 1897, suffrage bodies all over the country formed a national organisation, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and you can see their leader pictured here, Millicent Fawcett. The NUWSS were committed to peaceful methods of campaigning, petitioning, lobbying, marching, and they had I want to sort of dwell on this before we move on to the suffragettes, because they were a much larger body than the suffragettes were. By 1913, the NUWSS had a membership of 50,000, compared to the more militant and well-known union, the WSPU, which had 2,000. So being a member of one did not necessarily preclude being a member of the other, I should say, and many women would have had sympathy for both. But I think it's interesting and perhaps not well known that far more women chose to join the peaceful marching, petitioning, lobbying body rather than the militant one. And it had its own identity as well, which is a little bit different from the suffragette movement we know today, that we see in popular culture with the colours of green, purple and white. That is the militant suffragette colours. But in fact, the non-militant organisation, the NUWSS, had different colours, red and white and green, as you can see here. They started off with red and white and they added green later on. And in fact, all the different suffrage organisations, and there were a lot of different ones by the early 20th century, they all had different colour schemes. And so it's, I think, again, we should remember that it wasn't just sort of one look, one brand, one message necessarily. There were a lot of different messages and branding coming out of these organisations. This is a little pin badge. It might look big on the screen, but the real badge is about this small. But it's been blown up nice and big here, so you can see where they were based, Great Smith Street, which is just opposite the Houses of Parliament in Westminster. So they had a home really quite close to the centre of power. I'm just going to talk a little bit about petitioning for the South West, because when I was asked to give this talk, I thought, let's see what I can find for Exeter. I didn't really know what I was going to find, and so I had a look in the early petition records held in the Parliamentary Archives. Now, as I say, the original petitions with all the signatures and so on don't survive except in very, very small numbers. But we do have a record of the petitions because they were all beautifully logged and noted and the signatures counted by the clerks in the House of Commons. And so this is the earliest petition I could find a trace of from the South West. I hope you can see in the middle there Truro. So this petition is from 1868 from the inhabitants of Truro, and it was presented by Mr Taylor MP, and it had 30 signatures on it. And I don't know how big Truro was in those days. Maybe some people in this room know better than me, but 30 signatures doesn't sound like a bad number to me for this very early date. 1868, it would have been one of the very earliest petitions to come to Parliament. And I also wondered who Mr Taylor might be who presented it. Petitions are usually presented by the local MP, but in fact this is not the case. There were two MPs called Taylor in this period, neither of whom were MPs for this area. I think this one is Peter Alfred Taylor, who was actually a radical Liberal MP for Leicester, who was known to be in favour of universal suffrage, including women. And his wife, Clementia Taylor, was one of the organisers of the 1866 John Stuart Mill petition. So I think it's interesting to note that Mr Taylor, possibly influenced by his wife maybe, was busy presenting petitions here for the inhabitants of Truro. The earliest petition I could find from Devon, or at least Devon today, is Plymouth. You can see at the bottom there. Plymouth, and it has, I can't read this here, 63 signatures which have been noted there. It's actually described, I think, as being from Somerset, so I don't know if Plymouth maybe used to be in Somerset. Maybe some of you know this better than me, or maybe it's just a mistake, I don't know. But if it was presented by the same guy who presented the petition above it, Mr Gore Langton, then this was William Henry Powell Gore Langton, who was a MP for Somerset West, a supporter of John Stuart Mill, and again with a wife who was sympathetic to the cause. His wife, Lady Anna, was president of the Bristol and West of England branch of the National Society for Women's Suffrage in 1874. So again, I think we can see maybe some family circumstances here. And finally, I did find some petitions from Exeter the following year, 1870. So if you can see at the top there, we have Exeter there with 59 signatures, and down here with 56 signatures. And the petition at the top was presented by Sir Massey Lopes, who was MP for South Devon. I couldn't find any suffrage connection with him particularly, but the one below here was presented by Mr Bowring, and this is Edgar Alfred Bowring, who was Liberal MP for Exeter from 1868 to 74. He was a local MP, but he also had a suffrage connection because his not his wife in this case, but his sister-in-law, Deborah Bowring, was a keen supporter of the women's suffrage movement and became one of the vice presidents of the Bristol and West of England Society for Women's Suffrage in 1871. So it's a final example of sort of these sort of family connections of these early petitioners, I think. And this is the last one I've got to show you. I know that this university has a branch of Falmouth, so I've spotted Falmouth for next year. There we go, inhabitants of Falmouth, there you go. 185 signatures, not bad at all, I think. And that was presented by the Falmouth MP, whose name was Edward Backhouse Eastwick. So there you go. Petitioning did carry on, I should say, after this very early period, well into the suffragette era in the early 20th century, although it did decrease in importance. But there was a large amount of petitions presented in 1910 when various bills were going through Parliament. And I did find petitions from Exeter, Cornwall, Mid-Devon and Plymouth. So petitioning did not sort of die out after this. It did sort of stay on. It just became less important. And the reason it became less important is because tactics switched. So the suffragettes, the most famous suffragette movement is the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, which was founded in 1903 by this lady here, Emmeline Pankhurst. And most people who otherwise know nothing about suffragettes will have heard of Emmeline Pankhurst. She founded the WSPU because she was impatient at the lack of progress, and as I've just described, petitioning had actually started all the way back in 1832. From 1866 it had grown in importance, and yet nothing had happened, no success at all in influencing Parliament to give women the vote, and therefore some women decided they should try some different methods. So they were militant and violent, and this means campaigns against people and property, most famously things like smashing windows, but also more extreme things like planting bombs, physically attacking people, as well as sort of more civil disobedience and disruption kind of tactics. And they did all this to gain publicity for their campaign. And as a result, you get scenes like this one in the Houses of Parliament. This, you may be able to read at the bottom, it says, "The disgraceful scene in the House," carrying the demonstrative women suffragists from the central lobby. Suffragists is the name usually used for the more peaceful campaigners, but this is such an early image, 1906. I think the name suffragette had not quite gained common currency by this point. Suffragette began as a nickname, a sort of insulting nickname given by the tabloids, but it was claimed by the women, and who became proud of it, and a badge of honour to call themselves suffragettes in situations like this. Now, if you can see the picture here, this is a central lobby in the Houses of Parliament. You've probably seen it on the news with newsreaders standing up in there talking about the events of the day. And as you can see, it's chaos there. Votes for women, and there are lots of police trying to hold women back. There are women sort of standing on seats, waving banners, and you can see there a woman being grabbed, quite manhandled, possibly quite roughly by a policeman. And the police in Parliament had something of a battle over the years with suffragettes between 1906 and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. These are the two men who were responsible for security within the Houses of Parliament. Sir David Erskine, who was a Sergeant-at-Arms. The Sergeant-at-Arms is an important role in Parliament and responsible for ceremony and security of the building in these days, as well as a number of other functions. And this is, on the right there, you can see Chief Inspector Charles Scantlebury, and he was in charge of the Metropolitan Police, who were based in the Palace of Westminster. And to this day, there are a lot of police who are charged with looking after the Palace of Westminster. And it was poor old Scantlebury in these days who had to write lots of reports to the sergeant explaining the latest suffragette battles that had taken place in the building. In the Parliamentary Archives where I work, we have a series of about 80 or so police reports in this period describing suffragette activity within the Palace of Westminster. This is just to give you an idea what these reports look like. The handwriting there is Inspector Scantlebury. You might just be able to see his name at the end there, Scantlebury, and it's addressed to the Sergeant Erskine, whose name is at the bottom there. And this particular report is about Black Friday, which was a very famous suffragette demonstration in November 1910. The date's up the top there. Black Friday, a lot of women demonstrated outside Parliament and Parliament Square. There were more than 100 arrests and cases of assault, certainly physical assault, possibly sexual assault by policemen on women there. However, our report in the Parliamentary Archives describes the situation within the building, and if you were to read it word for word, which I'm not going to do now, it sort of describes in great detail how various women made their way through the building, and they passed Mr Asquith, the Prime Minister, going the other way, and they didn't see each other, and it all got very complicated. And the end result was it all passed, if you can see the very last line, they're all passed off peacefully within the building, because that was what their primary concern was. But it's quite interesting because all passing off peacefully is not how Black Friday tends to be described and understood. And again, I thought you might be interested in a local connection here in Devon. I was privileged to meet a gentleman called Jeff Beach a couple of years ago, who's from Hillhead, Brixham in Devon, and his grandmother was a suffragette. Her name was Fanny Radcliffe, and her name is on this certificate here. You might be able to read it very well because it's behind that sort of rather intricate pattern there. But that does say Fanny Radcliffe, and this is a certificate. It's from the WSPU, and it's signed at the bottom by Emmeline Pankhurst. She was involved in WSPU protests on and after Black Friday, and Mr Beach found this and other documents about her after his mother died. This is another of the documents that he showed me, and this is a record of window breaking, 33 Eccleston Square, which is where Winston Churchill lived in those days, and see 33 Eccleston Square is there, and her name is at the top there. She was bound over the sum of £5 to appear at Bow Street Magistrates' Courts and went to prison. And this was the usual suffragette tactic, that they would be fined, they would refuse to pay the fine, and they would go to prison. I mentioned the suffragette colours that we know today, and here's an example of this in use, but on a piece of WSPU memorabilia, which is owned by our Works of Art department in Parliament. This is Emmeline Pankhurst's Prisoner's Medal. You can see the colours here. You can see it says Holloway at the top, and that's Holloway Prison, where the suffragettes were imprisoned. You have a date here, and it says H24 there, which stands for hospital block, second floor, cell 4. Second floor, cell 4. Yes, so it was a record of her imprisonment, and this was awarded to Emmeline after a rush on Parliament in 1908. And this was quite an event in Parliament, that leaflets were distributed all over London by suffragettes saying, come and rush the Houses of Parliament. And there was indeed a great rush on Parliament, although the police managed to hold the line and they didn't actually break in the building. But Emmeline and her daughter Christabel and Flora Drummond, another WSPU leader, were arrested for inciting violence because they'd encouraged people to rush Parliament. They went on trial. Christabel, who was a trained lawyer, defended them in court, and she called the politicians of the day to the witness box to ask if they felt threatened by all the women outside the building, to which they had to say, of course not. But and that's she hoped that would help their case. They were found guilty and sent to prison, though. And I should perhaps add as an aside that Christabel was a trained lawyer, but unable to practice because women could not practice as lawyers until 1919. Anyway, and when Emmeline came out of prison, she was awarded this medal. And you might think, why award a medal? And that's because the WSPU saw themselves as an army. They were very sort of strict. The leadership, led by the Pankhurst, Emmeline and her daughters, were very strict about what should and shouldn't be done, and therefore they awarded medals for deeds not words being their slogan. And as well as Christabel, the other daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, who is well known, is Sylvia Pankhurst, who was a little different from her mother and her sister. She was an artist, a trained artist, and she designed a lot of the magnificent WSPU promotional material, like the certificate we saw a few slides back, and this brooch here, which again is a prison brooch, and you can see the portcullis here, which is a symbol of Parliament, which is why we rather like it, working in Parliament here. And it's got the WSPU colours, the purple, green and white in the middle there. So I've talked a lot about the WSPU, and I'm now going to move on to talk about another branch of the suffragette movement, the Women's Freedom League, who split from the WSPU in 1907 because they were also involved in attacks on Parliament, which we have documented in the Parliamentary Archives. It was less militant than the WSPU, and a bit more democratic in the way it was run, and it preferred tactics such as passive resistance to taxation, non-cooperation with the census, about which I'll say in a bit more in a minute, rather than the violent campaigns against people and property. And its leaders included the socialist Charlotte Despard, who you can see here, and the political theorist Teresa Billington Greig. The WFL carried out a number of actions in Parliament, including a famous protest in the Ladies' Gallery in the House of Commons in 1908. I'm going to show you, this is my favourite document in the Parliamentary Archives. We've got about 3 million records in the Parliamentary Archives going back more than 500 years, but this is my favourite, and if I had to pick one, this would be it. It's a banner unfurled, as you see, from the Ladies' Gallery on the 28th of October 1908, and although it looks big on the screen here, again, like some of the other things I've shown you, it's not that big. It's maybe sort of A2 size, like that. But what's interesting about it is, as I say, the event how it came to end up in Parliament. Now, the WFL had drawn up this proclamation you can see here, and they printed something like 5,000 bills like this, which were gummed on the back, and they went all over London, slapping them up on buildings, on post boxes, wherever they would go. And none of those have survived, as far as I'm aware, because they were gummed and stuck on pillar boxes and they got washed away. This one survived because it was actually pasted on a piece of cloth, you can see there, mounted on bamboo sticks at the top and the bottom. And the reason for that is because it was taken into the Ladies' Gallery in the House of Commons by 3 suffragettes. Now, I should explain what I mean by the Ladies' Gallery. Back in these days, women could not sit with men to watch parliamentary debates. They had to sit segregated from the men in this area called the Ladies' Gallery. And as you can see here, it's something of a gilded cage. It's got big windows, but the windows are covered with heavy metal grills. And this made it very difficult to see or hear. It made the whole space feel very confined, stuffy, smelly, and it was much hated by most of the women who had to sit there and try and see and hear debates. As a result of this, it became something of both a physical and metaphorical symbol of women's exclusion from Parliament. And the grills here were attacked by the suffragettes in this dispute in 1908. And so what happened is that at a particular point in the evening, the three suffragettes in the Ladies' Gallery jumped up and started shouting, protesting, and 2 of them chained themselves to the grille. The third one stuck the banner through the grille and lowered it into the House of Commons, where it must have caused quite a stir. If you can picture an all-male House of Commons discussing the licensing bill, which is what they happened to be discussing that evening, and suddenly this thing appeared, there's a great furore, and this thing appears high up above the Speaker's chair and is lowered into the chamber. And in the meantime, as I say, 2 of the suffragettes chained themselves to that grille. The authorities could not immediately get them off the grille, so they took the whole grille out the window, frog-marched the suffragettes out and cut them off in a committee room. And we have the police report in the Parliamentary Archives describing it, which is on the left there. The 2 suffragettes who chained themselves to the grille were Helen Fox and Muriel Matters, whose names you can see there. Muriel Matters was an Australian suffragette and well known as an Australian suffragette in the UK. Women did have the vote in Australia by this point. Nice to see an Australian here campaigning instead. And it was a very successful event in the sense it was very disruptive. This was one of 3 simultaneous demonstrations going on by the 3 suffragettes in the Ladies' Gallery, by another group of suffragettes in St Stephen's Hall, which is where people queue up to go and watch proceedings in Parliament, and also a simultaneous demonstration by 2 men in the Strangers' Gallery, which I think we should remember that there were male suffragettes, that is to say men who not only sympathised but were willing to campaign along with the women, and they were also chucked out very speedily at this event. But it's nice to know that they managed to disrupt proceedings to the extent that there is no Hansard record of what is said at this point in proceedings that evening. So Hansard is the official edited verbatim record of speeches in Parliament, and what it says at this point is the remainder of the speech by Mr Remnant was inaudible in the Press Gallery on account of a disturbance in the Ladies' Gallery where 2 ladies had chained themselves to the grille and endeavoured to address the House in favour of women's suffrage. Eventually the ladies were removed. So they did affect the official report as it were. I'm now going to say a little bit about Emily Wilding Davison. Now, again, if you don't know much about suffragettes, but you've heard of a name or two, you've probably heard of Emmeline Pankhurst, and you've probably heard of Emily Wilding Davison, who was in the news an awful lot last year, 2013, because that was 100 years since her death, following a protest at the Derby, when she protested against the King's horse, went down under the horse and died in hospital 4 days later. She was a member of the WSPU, but she also acted independently. She was a bit of a rebel, and on some occasions the WSPU leadership, the Pankhurst and so on, did disassociate themselves from what she did. She seemed to have a particular affinity for Parliament, because we have quite a number of police reports that feature her particularly. You can see little extracts here. You might be able to pick out her name there, Emily Davison, where is she there? Emily Davison, and so on and so forth. So she hid in a ventilation shaft. She was found on a staircase near the members' library in the middle of the night. She threw a stone through a division lobby window. She broke a window at the Crown Office. There's 5 or 6 occasions like this which are documented in the police report. And as a result, she was banned from the building. This is the letter. The gentleman you can see on the right there is the Speaker, Speaker Lowther, and he wrote to the sergeant following one of these incidents, and what he says here is, "Dear Erskine, a lady who breaks the windows of the Crown Office and gets into our ventilation shaft is evidently not a desirable personage to have hanging about St Stephen's Hall, so her name had better go on the Index Expurgatorius." So there you go. That's how they wrote in those days. The Index Expurgatorius being a blacklist of people banned from the building, which had several suffragettes' names on it, now including Emily Wilding Davison. But most famously, Emily hid overnight in Parliament. Ooh. Someone's trying to tell us something. Yeah. Okay. They've turned it off. Shall I carry on? Yes? Okay, right. Okay. So, assuming that's finished. Everything okay? Jolly good, thank you. Most famously, Emily Wilding Davison hid overnight in Parliament on census night in 1911. Now, census night, as today, census enumerators went round to all the houses of everyone in the country and got them to, the head of household had to fill out a form with their name and everybody who was living at that address on that particular night. And so suffragettes used the census to campaign in various ways. Some suffragettes chose to evade the census on the grounds that if they didn't have a vote, they didn't want to be counted either. And some of them famously sort of hid out overnight. They went skating all night on an ice rink. They all sort of hid in houses, and which were 20, 40, 50 suffragettes in a house. So that they then barred entry to the enumerator. There were other women who spoiled their census forms, who wrote on them, no vote, won't be counted, that kind of thing. There were many suffragettes, and all suffragettes, just of course, who did comply with the census because they wanted to be counted and they didn't, and they thought that in fact complying with the rules of the land like this showed that they were worthy citizens who did deserve the vote. So there were all sorts of different approaches to the census. But Emily Wilding Davison, as usual, did her own thing, and she wanted to hide in Parliament so that she could write on her census form that that's where she lived on census night. And we had to wait nearly 100 years for the census forms to be released before we knew if she was successful or not. But I'm pleased to say she did. You can see the schedule here where it says Miss E.W. Davidson, they misspelt her name slightly, found hiding in the crypt of Westminster Hall since Saturday. So there you go. And she was in fact counted twice, because she was counted in Parliament, and also her landlady filled out a form for her in her lodgings. It's an interesting protest, and it was reported in the press at the time, and it was mentioned in the Houses of Parliament and so on, so she got her publicity. And it's something still remembered today, because Tony Benn MP put this plaque, which you can see on the right-hand side here, in the cupboard where she hid on census night. So down underneath, if you can picture Westminster Hall in the Houses of Parliament, you might have seen on TV, the great medieval hall. Just off that, there is a chapel of St Mary Undercroft down a flight of stairs, which is a very beautiful chapel, and there's a cupboard off the back plaque, and that's where she hid on census night. And so it's a very small cupboard. You can see it on the virtual tour on the Parliament website that includes the chapel. And to see it, you have to go right in the room, and then you have to sort of shut the door behind you and turn around to see the plaque, which is on the inside of the door. But that's what it says, so you can see it. You can see it very clearly here. And it's Tony Benn didn't ask anyone's permission. He just went down there with a drill and. Perhaps not quite in the middle of the night, but after hours, with another MP, I think, as well, a co-conspirator, and they just put the plaque up, and then he didn't mention it for a few years, and then he mentioned it in Parliament, and suddenly everybody knew about it. So there you go. Anyway, it's still there today, and it's a very nice reminder of one of the most famous suffragette activities within the building. I'm now going to say a little bit about forcible feeding. What you can see here is a leaflet against forcible feeding, which we have in the Parliamentary Archives because it was thrown into the House of Commons chamber during a protest in 1913. Suffragettes started to hunger strike from 1909. The first suffragette to go on hunger strike was called Marion Wallace Dunlop, who was also involved in a number of incidents in Parliament, including one occasion where she managed to stamp on a wall in St Stephen's where she was waiting to go in. She had a big cloak and an ink pad underneath her cloak, and when nobody's looking, she managed to stamp on the wall an extract from the Bill of Rights, basically claiming the same rights for women as men had. And as a result of that, and I think other activity too, she was arrested, went to prison, and went on hunger strike. And the authorities released her after a while because they did not want her to die and create a martyr. However, this tactic was quite widely taken up by suffragettes in prison, their rationale being that they wanted to be treated as political prisoners, and they weren't. That suffragettes were usually treated as very ordinary prisoners, and therefore suffragettes, many of whom were middle class, maybe even upper class women, found themselves sharing cells with prostitutes and thieves, and they didn't think they should be treated like that. And so they went on a hunger strike in attempts to be elevated to the higher grades of prison, which didn't happen. And after a while, the authorities didn't want to just simply release the women, and so they adopted this tactic of forcible feeding. Now, I think the best way to describe forcible feeding is to use the words of somebody who suffered it, and we're coming back now to Emily Wyland Davison, who writes about this in her memoirs. She was in Manchester prison one day on hunger strike when two doctors came into the cell, accompanied by 5 or 6 wardresses. They forced her down onto the bed. The doctor forced her head down violently onto the pillow. And if we just stop there and you think about that, just that scene, just even that far, and whether you think that's acceptable treatment for somebody. And then she goes on. While they held me flat, the elder doctor tried all round my mouth with a steel gag to find an opening. On the right side of my mouth, 2 teeth are missing. This gap he found and pushed in the horrid instrument, prizing open my mouth to its widest extent. Then a wardress poured liquid down my throat out of a tin enamel cup. What it was, I could not say, but it was some medicament that was foul to the last degree. As I would not swallow the stuff, the doctor gripped my nose and somehow gripped my tongue with the gag. The torture was barbaric. And that's what Emily wrote, and there are many other accounts of forcible feeding by Sylvia Pankhurst and others, and there are even oral history recordings of First, so you can even hear suffragettes talking about it today. I don't think there's much doubt that what they suffered was torture, and it wasn't just once, of course, but maybe 3 times a day, and some suffragettes underwent this hundreds of times. It wasn't always a tube down the mouth either, it was usually down the nose. There was no sterilisation, there was no hygiene at all in these cells, that it was just a simple rubber tube, and the liquid they put in was milk, often with lumps of bread in it, which was very difficult to digest anyway. And it was barbaric, and there was a great outcry against it. And this included some prominent members of Parliament, particularly Keir Hardie, the Labour leader, and George Lansbury, another very prominent Labour politician who actually resigned his parliamentary seat and fought a whole by-election on this issue, which unfortunately he lost. But there was sympathy in Parliament, I should say, in some quarters for suffragettes who were forcibly fed. Eventually, the government had to adopt a different tactic, and therefore we get an Act of Parliament passed, which is better known as the Cat and Mouse Act, although its full name is the Prisoners' Temporary Discharge for Ill Health Act of 1913. The Cat and Mouse Act is what the Cat and Mouse Act did was it allowed the authorities to release hunger striking women, wait till they regain their health, and then rearrest them and continue their prison sentence. And this might sound more humane than forcible feeding, and I guess it was to an extent. But again, some women would just go through this again and again and again. So they would go into prison, nearly starve themselves, be released, get better, and then carry on. And they would never finish their sentence. They would just go on and on and on in an endless cycle of being arrested and rearrested and rearrested, and it is a different form of torture, I think, in some ways. Some suffragettes made a bit of a game out of it, and it's called the Cat and Mouse Act because it was likened to a cat playing with a mouse, letting it go and running off for a bit, only to catch it again and claw it back in. There are tales, for example, of Emmeline Pankhurst out on release under the Cat and Mouse Act, the police turning up to rearrest her as she came out the front door. In fact, it was an actress in her dress, and the real Miss Pankhurst was going out the back door. So there was something of the cat playing with the mouse. But anyway, as I say, it was also not satisfactory and not well received by suffragettes for other reasons. And so things have really sort of escalated and built up and built up and built up. And then the First World War comes along and everything changes. Now, the militant suffragette campaigning by the WSPU was suspended on the outbreak of war in 1914, almost exactly 100 years ago now. Emmeline Pankhurst and Christabel Pankhurst joined the war effort, a campaign for women to work in munitions factories. Sylvia Pankhurst, who was a pacifist, opposed the war and campaigned against it. And other suffragettes and indeed suffragettes acted in different ways. Some of them supported the war effort, some didn't. But although the sort of overt suffragette campaigning ceased, though, although the behind-the-scenes lobbying carried on. And what we then have at the end of the war is that finally some women got the vote. This is the Representation of the People Act 1918, which gave all men and some women the vote for the first time. I emphasise the some. You can see the reasons, the qualifiers here. So a woman could be a voter if she has attained the age of 30 years and meets various property qualifications, which are described there. So the reason this act was passed was not actually to give women the vote, it was to give men the vote. And the reason for this is because, of course, men had fought in the war, enormous numbers of men had died in the war, and it was not acceptable that some of the soldiers fighting would not be able to vote when they returned to England afterwards. We have to remember that something like 40% of men could not vote before 1918 either. So a large number of soldiers, particularly working class soldiers, would not have been eligible to vote if it wasn't for this act. By 1918, there was really no reason why some women shouldn't get the vote at the same time. It's too simplistic to say women got the vote for their war work. You often hear this said quite glibly. Now, of course, women did fantastic war work, which you hear a lot about in history programmes and so on, particularly in munitions factories, but also in all sorts of other walks of life, working in agriculture, on the land, filling in for men as things like postal workers and driving buses, and basically filling in for pretty much everything that men did once the men were called up in large numbers to go and fight. However, the women that did a lot of this work were exactly the ones who didn't get the vote. Most of the munitions workers, for example, were young women under the age of 30 and did not get the vote. So it is too simplistic to say women got the vote because of their war work. Rather, it's the case that women's war work helped change the cultural and the political landscape, which happened during the First World War. It enabled everyone to climb off their high horses, the politicians to take a step back and go, actually, women are doing great things, the suffragettes to stop campaigning and to say, actually, yes, women are doing great things as well. But we still have this age 30 limitation, though, and the reason for that is because if women had got the vote on the same terms as men, which was at age 21 in these days, the women voters would have outnumbered the men because so many women were lost in the war, and this was not seen as acceptable politically at the time. For women to outnumber men at this point, people were nervous about how women would vote. It was thought women might vote for, would only vote for other women, would vote for weird and wonderful political parties, wouldn't know how to vote, that kind of thing. And so it was seen as a safeguard to give women, put in an age limit of 30 years old and to put in a property qualification as well. And those things together meant hopefully it was the older, more respectable women with a stake in the country and so on. And the property qualification is often forgotten, but it does mean that approximately 22% of women over the age of 30 still couldn't vote after this. So we are still some way off equality. Having said that, some women had the vote, and it was a great achievement. the same year, 1918, an act was passed allowing women to become MPs. The first general election, which women could vote at, was in December this year, 1918. One woman was elected in 1918, but she did not take her seat. Her name was Constance Markovic, and she was a Sinn Féin MP. And as still happens to this day, Sinn Féin MPs do not take their seats in the Houses of Parliament. And Constance Markovic was actually in prison at the time in Dublin, I believe. So she never took her seat. We have to wait another year for the first woman MP to take her seat, and this is her, Nancy Astor. Nancy Astor was in many ways the most unlikely first woman MP. She wasn't a suffrage campaigner herself. She didn't have any background in that. She was American. She was a divorcee. As I say, in many ways a very unlikely candidate. However, the reason she became the first woman MP was because her husband was previously MP for Plymouth Sutton before 1919. Then his father died, and he was elevated to the peerage to take his father's seat in the House of Lords. And you can't be a member of the Lords and the Commons at the same time, so he had to resign his seat in the Commons. He didn't want to do this, and then it was suggested locally that his wife Nancy, who was very well known and thought of locally, would be a good person to step up and take the seat for him. And that's exactly what happened. And although, as I say, she didn't have any suffrage campaigning background, nevertheless, as soon as she arrived in the Houses of Parliament, she got an enormous postbag from the word go from women all over the country who saw her as their MP. And she felt that she was there to represent them. And she was in Parliament for a long time, continuously from 1919 until 1945. And she never stopped campaigning and supporting causes for women, equality and children. She was joined by a few other women shortly, by the first Liberal, Margaret Wintringham, in 1921, and then three women, Margaret Bonfield, Susan Lawrence and Dorothy Jewson, were elected for Labour in the general election of 1923. Bonfield subsequently became the first cabinet minister in 1929. However, you shouldn't see this as a sort of big influx. It's because the numbers of these women MPs is absolutely tiny. There were 24 women MPs elected in 1945, so post-Second World War. This is in a House of 650. 25 women, and the numbers don't change very much for many years. There were only 23 as late as the 1983 general election. You don't get any sort of a big advance in numbers until 1997, when we have 120 elected. And today, I think women account for about a fifth of the House of Commons, which is a big advance on how it was in Nancy Astor's day. Arguably not enough, I think many people would say. Just to sort of go back a little bit to what happened after Astor took her seat, campaigning continued by the women's suffrage organisations, not just for equal franchise for the vote, but also for a whole number of other causes. A lot of my PhD on Parliament and women in the early 20th century was actually about this, that following 1918 we have a whole host of legislation affecting women's lives and gender equality that improved things in all sorts of ways over the next 10 years or so. And I think this is really important to remember, that women were not just interested in the vote for its own sake, but because they could do things with it. That once they became electors, that suddenly MPs, the male MPs, would take them seriously, would take their causes seriously, and there's just no denying that you get almost no legislation about issues such as women entering professions, about rights for widows and orphans, property law, and so on and so forth. You get almost none of this before 1918, and you get a whole raft of this kind of thing after 1918. Culminating in equal franchise. So 10 years later, women finally get the vote on the same terms as men. That is to say, age 21 and without any property restrictions. This was passed by a Conservative government thanks to the support of the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and his Home Secretary, William Joynson Hicks. I should say that there was a great deal of opposition in this Conservative government, led by Winston Churchill, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer. Churchill was not a great friend of women's equality. He did obviously many other great things in his political career, but advancing women's rights was definitely not one of them. And at the final cabinet vote that agreed to put this act forward in 1927, there's a little note in the National Archives attached to the cabinet minute that says, the Chancellor of the Record asked for it to be placed on record that he disagreed with this and thought it would mean ruin to the Conservative Party. So there you go. As I say, they didn't really know how women would vote in those days. It's before sort of professional polling in the way that we have it today, and they just didn't know. Whereas, in fact, what history tells us since is that actually women vote on very much the same issues and in similar ways to men. but they did not know that back in 1928. I've almost finished everything I'm going to say to you. I'm just going to say a few words at the end here about the other house in Parliament, the House of Lords. Now, does anyone here know when women were able to sit in the House of Lords? Lots of blank faces. 1958 is the answer to that. Now, there's a little story before that, which I'm going to tell you, because of this woman, Lady Rhondda. So, after women got the vote, some women, in 1918, and women started to become MPs, albeit in very small numbers, the campaign started to get women into the House of Lords. The House of Lords in those days was an almost entirely hereditary body, though. Apart from special cases like bishops and law lords, you had to, the only way to get into the House of Lords was to have a father who was in the House of Lords, and his father before him, and so on and so forth. And not many women inherited peerages. However, it was possible by special circumstances for a woman to inherit a peerage, and this lady did on the death of her father. This is Margaret Hague Thomas, Viscountess Rhondda. Now, she was a suffragette. She was a militant suffragette, a member of the WSPU from Wales, and her father was D.A. Thomas, who was a cabinet minister during the First World War under David Lloyd George. Now, D.A. Thomas did not have any sons, but he was very proud of his daughter. Margaret helped him in his business interests, and he had enormous coal and other business interests in Wales and so on. And Margaret acted very much as a son would have done in sort of joining a family business and helping look after his affairs and so on. During the First World War, both father and daughter were on a trip to America and came back on the Lusitania and were there when it was bombed and sank. D.A. Thomas was rescued quickly, but Margaret ended up in the water and had to survive there for hours, clinging to a bit of driftwood before she was rescued. She later wrote in her autobiography that after she went through that, she thought she could deal with anything. And so she went on, as I say, and she was a great egalitarian feminist between the wars. She led all sorts of important organisations. She set up the 6 Point Group, which campaigned for equality, and a very important feminist magazine called Time and Tide, which had a very long history even after her death. But her interest in parliamentary terms lay in the fact that her father became a peer, entered the House of Lords in gratitude for the war work he'd done in the First World War. And because he had no sons, there was a special remainder allowing him to leave the title Viscount to his daughter as Viscountess after his death. And so after he died, if Margaret had been a boy, she would have just inherited her father's seat in the House of Lords and gone and sat there and voted on legislation and debated and so on, like a man would have done. Because she was a woman, she couldn't. But because she was Lady Rhondda, she took her case to the House of Lords and argued she should be allowed to take her seat. She took her case to the Committee for Privileges, which is the body that hears such things in the Lords, and at first she won. They first found in her favour, and there are newspaper articles and letters in the press heralding women and ladies in the Lords. But then word of this got to the Lord Chancellor, a gentleman called Lord Birkenhead, who was not sympathetic to equal rights for women at all. He reconvened the Committee for Privileges and packed it with his supporters, and they found against her the second attempt. So she never managed to take her father's seat in the House of Lords, which is a great shame because I think she would have been a great asset. The sort of silver lining in the overall story, though, is that the House of Lords had the opportunity to buy this very beautiful oil painting of Lady Rhondda a few years ago, which they did, and it now hangs in Peer's dining room in the House of Lords. So she did enter the House of Lords in a sense in recent years, and I feel she sort of took her place here then. But she died just a little bit early. She died in 1958, just a little bit early to enter the House of Lords as a life peer. So by 1958, the House of Lords had become largely moribund, because it was full of hereditary peers. There were very few Labour hereditary peers because Labour politicians were often opposed to peerages on principle and were not willing to take them, and this meant that government, when Labour in government, and opposition, when Labour in opposition, work was carried out by about 3 men, and it just was not sustainable. And the solution that they eventually found was to enable life peerages to be created. That is to say, you get created a member of the Lords for life, and you don't pass on your seat to your children, which people like trade unionists and other a greater variety of people willing to accept. And by 1958, when we finally get round to this Act being passed, again, by this point there was really no reason not to include women. So 4 women peers were created in 1958. The first to be created was the criminologist and sociologist Barbara Wootton, and the first to take her seat was Stella Isaacs, who was Baroness Swanborough, founder of the Women's Voluntary Service. The other 2 were Catherine Elliott and Irene Curzon, Baroness Ravensdale. And although this was obviously a great step forward, and again, today the House of Lords is largely made up of life peers, and again, women make up about a fifth of them, and have had all the sort of prominent positions in the House of Lords that they might be able to obtain. Nevertheless, 58 doesn't quite mark full equality, because it didn't allow hereditary women peers like Lady Rhondda here to take their seats. For that, we have to wait until 1963. 63 marks final equality when the passage of the Peerages Act, which is more famous for allowing Tony Benn to disclaim his peerage, also allowed hereditary women peers in their own right to take their seats in the Lords. Lady Rhondda had been dead several years by this point, but there was at least one woman who took her seat immediately, Baroness Strange of Knockin, who had held her title since 1921, unbelievably, finally got to take her seat in the Lords in 1963. And so finally, just over 50 years ago, we have full equality in Parliament. And that marks the end of my story. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you very much.